Right, welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today we welcome Gary Kirkilas. He's a pediatrician. Today's Kevin MD article is Cannabis Advertising Takes a Page from the Tobacco Playbook. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so before talking about the article itself, tell me your interest in cannabis advertising. Tell us the context that led you to write this article.
Yeah, so as a pediatrician, I have a fairly unique practice. Most of us as physicians work in traditional brick and mortar buildings. I have a pretty unique job out of Phoenix where I drive a mobile medical unit. And so we drive these to shelters, we drive these to group homes, to schools where the majority of the kids are below the poverty line. And I got to tell you, I just see a great change in this population and other populations, other demographics, social economic demographics, on this perception of what cannabis is
Hmm.
when I'm talking to my teenage patients. And, if I ask them about methamphetamines, if I ask them about crack cocaine, I get, grimacing faces and they say, oh, that stuff's horrible. But when I talk about cannabis, it's quite a different story. And I noticed this in my practice just progressively, how populations have changed their view of cannabis. And I started to look, why is this? Why do people feel this way? And there's a variety of reasons, but a lot of that has to do with the way cannabis is advertised, particularly if you're in a state that has legalized it. And this really just piqued my interest. How do we advertise cannabis? What are public perceptions? Does it have any effect on any of our youth? And so that kind of just led me down a rabbit hole. And here I am now, got myself knee deep in cannabis policy, et cetera.
All right, so tell us about the article itself. Cannabis Advertising Takes a Page from the Tobacco Playbook. What's this about for those who didn't get a chance to read the article?
Sure. So I think many of us who had grown up will recognize or remember Camel Joe cigarettes. So,
Hmm.
a cartoon used to sell cigarettes. Some of us may even remember back in the 40s and 50s, one of the Camel cigarettes would often depict physicians saying more doctors smoke Camel cigarettes than any other, or
Hmm.
they might have these confabulated health claims like I'll have an ENT doc saying, not a single case of throat irritation with Camel cigarettes. And when I look back into that, it's kind of into our eyes and ears, it's kind of a weird thing to hear doctors promoting cigarettes. But when I take a look at that and I look how, the tobacco industry used cartoons, a lot of their advertisements targeted youth, they made these confabulated health claims. It's very eerie, but I'm seeing a lot of the same step-by-step approaches to cannabis. And it kind of happened organically. I just noticed in my state of Arizona, every December, we will see a billboard of a Santa Claus smoking a joint and saying something like, Happy Holiday Blaze, or Santa knows where to get his dopest gifts.
Hmm.
And I was just wondering, how could that be? And it just doing the research, looking back, and it's basically the same steps. Everything that tobacco has done, a very schematic, stepwise approach, cannabis does. And it makes sense. If back prior to the 20s and 30s, smoking cigarettes was a very fringe market. Guys in bowling alleys and mechanic shops, they smoked. But as a result of a very targeted and systematic approach by the tobacco industry, everybody started smoking.
Hmm.
Moms would smoke. Doctors smoked. You smoked in boarding and boardroom meetings. You smoke on airplanes, and it just exploded. And I fear that cannabis is doing the same thing in that same stepwise approach, where they target health concerns, then they target youth, they make sure it's cool. It goes on from there.
So, just for those who don't know, what are some of the health risks of cannabis, especially in your pediatric population?
Yeah, so anytime you're smoking any plant, it's not good for you. And I think um, most states, in their attempt to legalize cannabis for recreational use, first went down the path of this is medicinal, which is kind of odd because we already have things like Marinol and Epidiolex. But I'll leave that discussion for another time. But in that approach to have it as medicinal, that kind of just it's weird to me to think of smoking anything as a medicine. So that's to answer your question. That's my first step is when we think about the health effects, let's also remember that this is being touted as medicine. I'm no expert in cannabis. Potentially there are very well good uses, but first thing I think it behooves all of us to think about. We're talking about in some cases this is considered medicine, but as a pediatrician, we're seeing more and more cases of cannabis-induced psychosis.
Hmm.
We're also seeing many more cases of cannabis-induced hyperemesis, and then we're getting a whole lot of either purposeful or accidental ingestions by children. And a lot of this makes sense because, like the cannabis that many of us think about, like the cannabis of the Woodstock era or the 80s, that's 2 or 3% THC, producing mild euphoria. That's not what's being sold in stores. Now it's up to 30% THC in the actual butter flower, and then concentrates can be up to 100%. And a lot of these gummies will have like 10 milligrams of THC in them, and people can get themselves in trouble. So essentially, the supercharged THC is called wreaking havoc on us. It's completely unnatural. It was never meant for human consumption. So it's not surprising that we're seeing these things like hyperemesis, psychosis. And then, personally, we have patients who, they get into their parents' gummies all the time, or teenagers over consuming cannabis gummies because they don't really know what they're doing. And
Mm.
it's easy for them to do so because when you think about smoking a joint, you know what you're doing. You could smell it. It's a very visceral experience, and you're probably not going to smoke 2 or 3 more joints, right? In one sitting. With gummies, it takes long. The effect of being that THC takes longer. So, a new user might take one gummy, wait 15 minutes, not feel anything, then take 2 or 3 more, and now they're in like 5 joints worth, and then they end up in the emergency room with hyperemesis or nausea, vomiting, etc.
So, how easy or difficult is it for the pediatric population, the teenage population, to access these gummies or other cannabis related products?
Actually, fairly easy. I mean, the gummies themselves, thankfully, are only being sold in dispensaries, right? But all it takes is one person who's 21, either a peer, someone, a friend, and then instantly anyone that's below 21 has access to this. Prior to legalization, most cannabis was available as the flower, which again is a very visceral experience. People know what they're doing. But once you had legalization, all these more youth-targeted approaches, like flavored gummies and cookies, pizza, et cetera, that's infused with THC is now available to children.
And in terms of who's doing the advertising, they're the products themselves that you feel are explicitly advertising to children using steps from the tobacco playbook?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I mentioned, every December we see Santa Claus smoking joints. Social media is another interesting aspect. A lot of my patients have shown me on Instagram the posts. And very cleverly, Twitter or X is the only one that allows paid advertisements. However, on Facebook and Instagram, these dispensaries or brands can pump out posts constantly all day long.
Mhm.
They are not paid advertisement. They simply have to have in their bio nothing for sale. Although it's obvious it's ridiculousness because what else would a company be doing when they're producing posts? And many of these posts are just as egregious. So you'll see things like cartoons, free giveaways. A colleague of mine just showed me a hemp infused beverage, and it had a bunch of teens sitting on a stairwell of their school, and it said "school's out," and it had the word "school," and it had another euphemism for cannabis or getting high. So it's quite egregious. They know they're targeting the youth market, and it makes sense because if you target 40 or 50-year-olds, you only have them as a consumer for a couple,
Mhm.
for a decade or two. But if you target youth, then you have decades worth of committed user.
And again, for those who aren't aware, tell us about the potential habit forming properties that cannabis related products have.
A decade ago, that when this sort of topic came up, no one really talked about cannabis being habit forming. Everyone's mind was kind of centered around the opioids, and I will give it to them that yes, opioids has a very, very clear, distinct addiction pattern where their body, they're both mentally and physiologically, they're 100% addicted. However, as we learn more, we're learning things like, gaming, sexual activity, all these other things that produce dopamine in our brains can be very habit forming and have addictive properties to it. And I have patients who every morning before they go to school, they will vape. They will vape during class, during lunch, and they can't get through a day without doing it. Especially tie that with a youth that has, a mental health disorder like depression, anxiety. It's a lot different than your typical student or youth who is using it as a social lubricant on the weekends, hang out with their friends, get
Mhm.
high, or hang out with their friends, drink. But if you have a youth who has struggling with PTSD, anxiety, those are chronic illnesses. And
Sure.
so cannabis is hitching a ride every day that child experiences anxiety or depression. So that goes a long way too with persistent use.
And when you talk to your pediatric teenage patients and explain the potential health risks of cannabis, is this something that they have any insight about? Is it a complete shock to them when you first bring it up?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's kind of again why I'm at this fight is because the youth do not see it that way. They do.
Yeah.
If you ask them about methamphetamines, you'll get a very they see that as something that's very potentially dangerous. Cannabis is completely opposite, and this is not just my anecdotal experience. In every year, we have the monitoring the future, which is a youth survey that out of the University of Michigan, and they have tracked youth's perception of risk of use of cannabis. And like in the 70s, essentially no one thought cannabis use was dangerous, right? And
Hmm.
then as it went through the 80s and 90s, it increased where more and more people were being educated. They saw cannabis use as something that would be dangerous. Now we're right back to the levels we're in the 70s, where most youth just simply do not see it as something that's dangerous. And it makes sense. If you see something that perhaps your siblings are using, that your parents are using, some things that you see as billboards, especially if it contains cartoons, I mean, who blames them? I mean, of course you're going to think the thing is harmless if it's readily legalized, readily used, readily advertised.
So, what are some paths forward? I can think of things like regulating cannabis advertising, perhaps the health profession. We need a counter narrative that promotes some of the health risks of cannabis. So, what are some of the approaches that you see going forward to help this?
Things that I've been involved in is essentially just changing the law, changing cannabis health policy. So whatever tobacco is allowed to do, cannabis should be allowed to do, or something close to it. And I thought when I got into this, it would be a pretty easy, common sense sort of solution. You just say, okay, well, you can sell your products, legally, but don't use cartoons, don't advertise near schools, don't target youth. That was back in 2021. I worked with a legislator here in Arizona, and the bill just died. We tried it again the next year. Bill died again. I tried it last year in 2023. Bill died. The enemies of this come out of the woodwork. It's very, very difficult to pass any common sense cannabis law to change this. And it depends on which state. So if you're in a state like Arizona, like me, we legalize cannabis via voter initiative. Those are very difficult to modify. However, if you're from a state where they legalize cannabis in a traditional legislative bill, then it's a little more easy to make amendments. The issue is to make a bill or to create a voter initiative, it's very expensive. You need a lot of
Mhm.
resources. So typically the dispensaries themselves are the ones that are pushing these through because they stand to make a profit. They're not going to self-include things like we're not going to advertise this or we're not going to do
Sure.
this. They want to allow themselves the most greatest amount of freedom. So it takes people like us, like physicians, public health experts, teachers, parents, to urge our legislator to do something about it. And when you take a look at it, when we compare all the states, a lot of states will have some sort of verbiage like you can't target youth. But when you look down to the nitty gritty and you look at what is actually in those bills, it has nothing about cartoons, it has nothing about advertising near schools. So in reality, the United States is doing a very, very poor job. And essentially, we are repeating the mistakes that we did with tobacco.
So, other than the regulation route or the legislative routes, is there anything else that our public health physicians or public health officials can do?
Yeah, I think I would just urge, especially if you're in a primary care position, if you're a family doc, a pediatrician, to have those conversations, especially if you have a youth, just ask them. It doesn't have to be an interrogative process. Be like, I know a lot of youth are using. I just want you to let you know there actually are really bad things that can happen when you use them. You can mention things like hyperemesis. You can mention things like psychosis, and have a very frank discussion. Say, look, the cannabis that's available out today is supercharged. It has a lot of THC in it. It's really messing with our brains and our guts. It's not the best thing to be using. I know people think it's the greatest thing in the world, but I want to caution you, smoking anything, and this is what the kind of my key statement is, smoking anything, whether it's tobacco or marijuana, is bad for your lungs. You should not do it, and you should not consume it as a gummy either, because that THC can really mess with your brain.
We're talking to Gary Kirkilas. He's a pediatrician. Today's Kevin MD article is Cannabis Advertising Takes a Page from the Tobacco Playbook. So, what do you see in the coming years, assuming that cannabis advertising follows in tobacco's path? Well, what do you anticipate, assuming that we can't get any legislative solutions to this?
I mean, I hope not, but I think another smoking epidemic is going to occur. If we look at what happens with tobacco, again, a fringe market, no one really smoking cigarettes, a very targeted, systematic approach to increasing youth use, again, by addressing health
Mhm.
concerns, having doctors depicted, addressing youth with cartoons. The amount of people who smoke will increase, marijuana, cannabis, and then we'll have another smoking epidemic. That's what I fear. I hope it doesn't pan out that way. I hope that we can probably learn from our mistakes and have a concentrated health effort. Some people say that maybe when it becomes legal federally, that maybe we'll take better approaches. I'm not sure. My fear is that when it becomes legal federally, a lot of the big industries, especially tobacco, will get involved, and all this mom and pop type advertising that we see from individual store owners are going to increase on a national scale, and it'll only get worse. But I would assume we'll probably have some degree of a smoking epidemic with cannabis. I think things might get worse before they get better. Kind of the newer thing that's coming out is hemp infused beverages. The thing with alcohol is it brings people together, right? People come together, they enjoy a glass of wine, cocktails. You can't really do that with cannabis, right? And so what we're seeing now is the industry realizes this, and they want to have THC infused beverages so people can gather around and consume. And that's kind of the bigger push that we're seeing now. So we're kind of getting it on all sides. And yeah, I'm hoping like podcasts like this and people just become aware that this is an issue that we don't have to go down that road so it doesn't become an epidemic again.
And let's end with your take-home messages to the Kevin MD audience.
I would just say that if you're a provider in any capacity, have honest discussions with your patients about cannabis. Just, it doesn't have to be a long, prolonged conversation. Just say, cannabis is not good for you. It has a lot of bad effects. I also encourage this of all parents, have these conversations with you starting young, because I can guarantee you, if you're not talking to them about cannabis, if you're not talking to your patients, and you're not talking to your children about cannabis, somebody else is, and they probably don't have your child's or patient's best interest in mind. So it behooves you to have that conversation yourself.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Of course, thank you for having me.